In the summer of 1989, the Harvey family left their home without warning, abandoning phones, wallets, and unfinished breakfasts on the table. By nightfall, their truck was found empty on a country road, engine still running. No ransom, no witnesses, no struggle. Only silence where an entire family had stood hours before. What could drive four ordinary people to vanish together into the same thin air? The town lay tucked between the Blue Ridge foothills, a place so small that every mailbox still bore a family name, and every face was familiar from church or the feed store. Life followed the same rhythm it always had, slow, predictable, steady as the trains that cut through the valley twice a day. People there believed nothing truly strange could ever happen in Pine Bluff. That belief didn't last past June. The family at the center of it all were the Harveys. Richard, 53, a contractor who'd built most of the barns within 10 miles, his wife, Diane, 49, who kept the books for the business and the choir in tune at St. Matthew's, and their 3 grown children, Carla, 26, who worked as a receptionist in Asheville, James, 24, who helped his father on the job, and Lydia, 20, a college student home for summer break. They were respected, church-going, predictable. The kind of family whose name showed up in bake sale flyers and Rotary Club rosters, never in a police report. The evening before they disappeared, Saturday, June 10th, neighbors recalled nothing unusual. A radio played faint country music from the open windows of the Harvey farmhouse. Around dusk, someone saw Richard stacking lumber near the shed. He waved, called out something about an early job up the mountain. No one thought twice. By sunrise the next day, the Harveys were gone. When James didn't arrive at the lumberyard by 8, his foreman phoned the house. The line rang endlessly. By 10, the neighbor across the road, Mrs. Langley, walked over and found the front door open, the living room light still on, and the family truck missing from the drive. Inside, the scene was so ordinary it became eerie. Breakfast dishes washed and stacked, the coffee pot half full but cold. Diane's purse sat on the table beside her reading glasses. Upstairs, the beds were neatly made, every pillow in place. Even the family dog, Scout, had been left tied by the porch with a full bowl of water. When the county sheriff arrived, he expected to find signs of a break-in. There were none. The windows were locked from inside. The telephone cords had been pulled from the walls, not yanked in panic, but unscrewed carefully, as if someone had taken the time to make sure they couldn't ring. In Richard's home office, the desk drawers had been emptied, their contents spread across the floor. Receipts, invoices, old maps of mountain roads. It looked less like a robbery and more like a search. By noon, deputies had cordoned off the house. The town gathered, outside the fence, whispering theories. A burglary? A debt gone bad? A kidnapping? None of it made sense. Nothing valuable was missing except the family themselves. That afternoon, one clue surfaced. A gas station attendant 20 miles north in Marion County reported that a blue Ford pickup matching the Harveys had stopped for fuel just after dawn. Richard had been driving, Diane in the passenger seat, the 2 girls in the back. They looked worn out, the attendant later told police. Like they hadn't slept, but they weren't arguing. Just quiet. He paid cash, didn't take a receipt. From there, the trail turned thin. Around 3 p.m., a state trooper on Highway 221 thought he saw the same truck heading toward Virginia, but by the time patrol cars were dispatched, there was no trace. The radio broadcast went out that evening. Family of 5 missing from Pine Bluff, North Carolina, last seen traveling north in a blue Ford F-150. Inside the sheriff's office, investigators pinned a map to the wall, marking possible routes. Every theory led back to one question no one could answer. Why would they leave without a word? Friends interviewed later recalled that Richard had seemed tense in the weeks before. He'd complained about someone messing with his business papers, and once told his pastor he thought the phone line was bugged. Diane, too, had withdrawn from her usual circle, skipping choir practice, saying only that things at home were a little unsettled. Still, no one imagined the family might pack up and vanish overnight. The sheriff described the house that evening as too quiet to trust. There was no sign of struggle, yet everything felt wrong. The air stale, the clocks stopped, the silence thick enough to notice your own breath. In Richard's office, on the corner of a folded ledger, an officer found a note written in his blocky hand. "They're watching. If we go now, maybe we're safe." The note wasn't signed. When the sheriff read it aloud, the room fell silent. "Who's watching?" he asked. No one could say. By nightfall, Pine Bluff had become a ghost town of worry. Cars slowed as they passed the Harvey property, headlights sweeping across the empty porch. The neighbors left casseroles and prayers on the steps, though everyone knew no one was home to take them. The local radio station broke into its evening program to report the case, calling it a baffling family disappearance. The sheriff gave one brief statement. "We have reason to believe the Harveys left voluntarily. We just don't know why." The following morning, when the sun rose over the Blue Ridge ridgeline, the fields behind the Harvey house were still wet with dew. The family's garden tools lay where they'd been dropped. Nothing stirred but the dog, waiting patiently by the fence. Some in town said the Harveys had gone into hiding. Others whispered of cults, debts, or government plots. But as the days passed with no word, the story took on a different weight. Not the urgency of crime, but the heaviness of mystery. Years later, people would remember that first week less for what was found than for what wasn't. No ransom calls, no fingerprints, no explanation. Just a house that looked perfectly ordinary, and a family that had somehow decided to walk out of it. Quietly, deliberately, and forever changed. No one in Pine Bluff could yet know that their disappearance would lead across 3 states into one of the strangest investigations the FBI had ever logged under the category Family Behavior Unexplained. But on that June morning, all anyone saw was a porch light left burning long after sunrise, and a silence that felt like the start of something that would never quite end. By dawn, on June 11th, 1989, a thin layer of mist hung over the hills of western North Carolina. The roads that wound through Pine Bluff were still empty, save for a few milk trucks and early risers heading toward Sunday service. No one noticed the blue Ford F-150 rolling out of town, its headlights off, its cargo bed stacked with suitcases, a gas can, and a small radio still tuned to static. Inside were 5 people who, for reasons no one would yet understand, had decided to run from their lives. At 6:23 a.m., the Harveys stopped for gas in Marion, about 40 miles north. A surveillance camera, grainy, black, and white, captured a brief, haunting image. Richard at the pump, scanning the parking lot as if expecting someone to appear. Diane sat beside him, staring straight ahead, motionless. In the back seat, the 2 daughters, Carla and Lydia, huddled close, whispering. The son, James, was the only one who seemed awake to how strange it all was. According to the station clerk, Richard paid in cash and refused a receipt. When asked if he wanted directions, he said quietly, "No one can help us now." Then they drove off, heading north towards the Blue Ridge Parkway, a route that wound through miles of forest and radio silence. As the hours passed, tension inside the truck began to fracture the family's composure. James, 24, had tried to reason with his father. "Dad, we're not being followed," he said, according to later interviews. "You're just tired." But Richard snapped back. "You don't see what I see. They've been listening for months." At 8 a.m., near a rest stop outside Boone, James insisted on leaving the car. He stepped out, carrying nothing but his wallet, and told his sisters, "Call the police if you can." It was the last time any of them would see him for 2 days. With one family member gone, Richard's paranoia deepened. He told Diane to roll down her window and throw away their map and her purse. "They can trace us through the cards," he said. She obeyed. Carla later recalled her mother's trembling hands as she dropped the items into the wind. By mid-morning, they crossed into Virginia. Witnesses at a diner near Soitu. Roanoke remembered a family matching their description. Silent, pale, eating without speaking. One waitress said Diane's hands shook so badly she spilled her coffee twice. Another recalled the father asking if anyone nearby used radios. When they left the diner, the waitress found a napkin under the coffee cup with a single phrase scrawled in pencil. "If they follow, take the caves." That note puzzled investigators for years. Locals later speculated Richard meant the Blue Ridge Caverns, a network of limestone caves stretching from Virginia into Tennessee, places remote enough to vanish in. By evening, the Harveys reached the Catawba Mountains, where they rented 2 rooms at the Ridgeview Motel. The clerk described them as polite but vacant, the kind of travelers who avoided eye contact. Around 10:30 p.m., the younger daughter, Lydia, asked where the nearest church was. When told there wasn't one nearby, she nodded and said softly, "We'll pray anyway." What happened next became the breaking point. Sometime after midnight, Carla woke to find her father pacing the parking lot, muttering. She watched from behind the curtain as he loaded tools into the truck, glancing up at the sky as if tracking invisible shapes. Diane stood nearby, clutching a small Bible to her chest. Carla later told investigators she felt an urgent fear she couldn't explain, like something terrible was about to happen if they didn't leave. At 2:15 a.m., Carla made a decision. She grabbed her sister's arm and whispered, "We're leaving." The girls slipped out of the motel room, crossed the road barefoot, and found an unlocked farm truck behind a nearby barn. They started it, drove off into the darkness, and didn't stop until sunrise. That same morning, about 60 miles away, a farmer named Elijah Ward reported seeing a blue pickup stranded on a dirt road near his property. He approached, but the man inside, later identified as Richard Harvey, rolled up the window and shouted, "Don't come closer." The truck then sped away towards the highway, leaving deep tire marks in the mud. By noon, the daughters reached a service station in Grafton and used a payphone to contact authorities. Their first words to the dispatcher were confused, frantic. "Our parents think someone's after us. We don't know what's real anymore." When local deputies found them, both women were dehydrated and disoriented. Carla insisted they had been followed by an unmarked van. Lydia said she couldn't remember the last 24 hours. Both refused medical care until an officer assured them they were safe. Meanwhile, James, the brother who had left earlier, appeared at a police station in Marion, exhausted but coherent. He explained that his father had been acting strange for weeks, checking the windows at night, unplugging the phones, saying their tax forms were being intercepted. "He thought the government wanted our land," James said. Then he started saying it wasn't the government, it was something worse. Back in Pine Bluff, investigators searched the Harvey home. What they found raised more questions than it answered. Financial records, tax statements, and hand-drawn maps were spread across Richard's office floor. On the wall hung a large map of the county, covered in red pins tracing roads that led into the forest. At the center, circled 3 times in black marker, was a single word: listen. By the end of the second day, news of the case reached Raleigh, then Washington. The FBI joined the search, classifying it as an interstate disappearance with psychological elements, a rare category used when multiple adults vanish together under delusional circumstances. For investigators, the challenge was not just locating the missing parents, it was understanding what they were running from. There was no evidence of debt, crime, or threat. Only fear, contagious, consuming, and utterly real to those inside it. On the third morning, officers in Virginia received a call from a gas station near Roanoke. A woman matching Diane's description had been seen walking barefoot along the service road, carrying a rosary and whispering, "We have to keep moving." When approached, she didn't resist, only asked, "Is it over?" It would take another 24 hours before Richard himself was found. Alone, still wandering, still convinced something was tracking the truck. But that part of the story belonged to the following days. The missing days when the Harveys' private terror became a public mystery, and the quiet town of Pine Bluff turned into the epicenter of one of America's strangest modern disappearances. No one had died. No crime had been committed. Yet for those watching, it felt like witnessing the collapse of something sacred, a family's shared reality, folding in on itself until none of them could tell which fears were imagined, and which might not have been. By the third day of the Harvey disappearance, what had begun as a local curiosity in Pine Bluff had turned into a matter of federal concern. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation had exhausted its local leads, and the file was passed to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, flagged under a rare classification: interstate disappearance with psychological factors. It meant this was no longer simply a missing person case. It was a psychological puzzle that spanned state lines. At the Harvey house, agents combed through every room. They moved slowly, photographing walls, notebooks, every document left in the open. What they found deepened the strangeness: stacks of financial records, property tax letters, and hand-drawn maps of county roads, marked with red circles and handwritten notes. "Listen, static here. Possible route north." Among them was an unsent letter addressed to the mayor of Pine Bluff, written in Richard's sharp, deliberate hand. "We are not safe. Someone knows what I filed. They are using the lines. Can't say more. Must move before it's too late." The agents couldn't determine whether lines referred to phone lines, power lines, or the invisible boundaries in Richard's imagination. Either way, it suggested the family's flight was deliberate, organized, not chaotic. The discovery made the local evening news that night. By morning, headlines across the state read, "The Vanishing Harveys, Family of 5 Flees Without a Trace." Television crews descended on Pine Bluff, filling the main street with satellite trucks and long lenses. The town's postmaster, who had known the Harveys for 20 years, shook his head on camera. They weren't the type to run. But maybe they saw something the rest of us didn't. The case hit national wires within 48 hours. CNN ran an early segment under the headline, "Family Vanishes Amid Paranoia Claims." By the time Nightline featured it that Thursday, the story had already taken on the tone of urban legend. Ted Koppel's voice introduced it. An American family disappears across 3 states, leaving no ransom, no suspects, and one haunting note: they're watching. The nation watched, half horrified, half fascinated. Meanwhile, the investigation intensified across Virginia. FBI field offices coordinated with state troopers to track every possible sighting of the blue Ford pickup. Dozens of calls came in, each more confusing than the last. One report described the truck abandoned near a service road outside Roanoke. Another placed it on Route 81, heading north at midnight. Both were true, in part. On day 3, a deputy in Roanoke County spotted a woman walking barefoot along the edge of the highway, clutching a rosary. Her hands were blistered, her dress torn. When asked her name, she hesitated before whispering, "Diane, we had to go." She didn't resist when officers approached, but she looked past them as though expecting someone else to emerge from the trees. At the hospital, doctors noted that she was dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. Her mind, however, was fractured. When an FBI agent asked where her husband was, she shook her head slowly and murmured, "He told us to keep moving. He said they tracked the truck through the power lines." The phrase puzzled investigators. Later, when they retrieved the truck near a rest stop 2 counties away, they found the radio smashed, wires hanging loose, as if someone had tried to silence it. Day 4 brought the final and strangest development. Around 2 a.m., a truck driver traveling north on Interstate 81 called in a sighting. A man walking alone in the breakdown lane, coat over his shoulder, talking to himself. When troopers arrived, they found Richard Harvey, exhausted, covered in dust, still murmuring. They tracked the truck. His eyes were unfocused, his words looping. When offered water, he asked if it was bugged. He was taken into protective custody, examined, and found physically healthy. When told that his wife and children were safe, he seemed confused. "You don't understand," he said. "They followed us before. They'll follow us again." Then he fell silent. For investigators, it was a riddle with no clear edges. Every member of the Harvey family was now accounted for. None injured, none accused of a crime. Yet the logic behind their flight remained incomprehensible. The media frenzy only deepened the mystery. Talk shows speculated wildly. Some claimed the Harveys had been victims of mind control experiments. Others blamed chemical contamination from nearby factories. Tabloids ran lurid covers calling it the family that ran from nothing. But behind the noise, the FBI's behavioral analysts worked quietly, building a psychological profile. Their conclusion, though tentative, was unlike anything the region had seen. A probable case of shared psychosis, a rare phenomenon where delusions spread within a close-knit group until reality collapses collectively. In their report, one line stood out. No evidence of external threat has been substantiated. The fear itself was the threat. Yet not everyone accepted that explanation. In the days that followed, letters poured into the sheriff's office from across the country. Some from conspiracy believers, others from ordinary people who saw their own anxieties mirrored in the Harveys' panic. "Maybe they knew something," one letter read. "Maybe the rest of us just haven't noticed yet." Back in Pine Bluff, the town's sense of safety cracked. People began locking doors in daylight. At the feed store, old men lowered their voices when the subject came up. "Folks don't just vanish unless they got a reason," one said. "Maybe they weren't crazy. Maybe they were right." But the facts, as cold as they were, told a simpler story. 5 people left their home believing they were in danger. 4 days later, they were found alive, frightened, and unable to explain what they'd fled. No ransom, no violence, no enemy, just a fear that had grown so real it drove them across 3 states. For the investigators, it was both a relief and a warning. Relief, because no crime had been committed. Warning, because something intangible, something that couldn't be arrested or proven, had nearly destroyed a family. As one FBI agent told a reporter quietly, off camera, "Sometimes the scariest cases aren't the ones with monsters. They're the ones where the monster was only ever a thought." By the end of that week, the Harveys were safe, but changed. Their home remained sealed for evidence, their business shuttered. Outside, a single porch light still burned every night, left on by James, the son who had first walked away. He said it wasn't for his parents anymore. It was for the moment the fear itself would finally stop coming back. And in Pine Bluff, people kept watching that light, wondering, had the Harveys been victims of their own minds? Or had they simply seen something the rest of the world refused to believe? By late summer of 1989, the frenzy had settled. The cameras left Pine Bluff. The headlines grew smaller, and what had once been the vanishing Harveys quietly turned into a matter for doctors, not detectives. The FBI closed its criminal file, transferring everything, notes, photographs, interview transcripts, to a team of psychiatric specialists at Duke University Medical Center in Durham, North Carolina. The report that followed would later become a landmark in American forensic psychology. The Duke team called it a folie à famille, literally, a madness shared by a family. It was a rare phenomenon, scarcely documented outside medical journals, in which delusion travels like contagion, passing from one mind to another until reason itself becomes collective illusion. At the center of that storm stood Richard Harvey, 51 years old, a man who by every measure of his earlier life had been solid, reliable, unremarkable. A foreman at the local mill for more than 2 decades, he was known as cautious with money and proud of self-reliance. But beneath that steadiness, investigators discovered layers of private strain. The family had recently lost a major timber contract, leaving them months behind on taxes. Richard had also developed insomnia and high blood pressure, both untreated. He withdrew from neighbors, stopped attending church, and spent long hours in his office, poring over invoices and tax forms that never seemed to balance. What began as anxiety over finances, doctors concluded, slowly mutated into suspicion. He started believing someone was interfering with his mail, then with the power lines outside their property. He told Diane that the government was auditing them secretly, that the phone line carried a hum that wasn't electrical. For months, Diane reportedly dismissed it as stress. But by spring, she had begun to see patterns too. Unmarked cars on the highway, letters arriving late, a flicker in the television screen that she said felt like a signal. The psychiatrists later described this as the absorption phase, where a partner begins to share, not necessarily the delusion itself, but the fear underlying it. Over time, that fear becomes indistinguishable from belief. The Harvey daughters, Carla and Lydia, were the next to succumb. They lived at home, helping with the family business, isolated from peers. Carla told one therapist that her father's fear became the air we breathed. She said he would unplug the phones at night, make them whisper during dinner, and forbid the television after dark. He said the signal carried their voices, she recalled. After a while, you stop asking who they are. To the Duke clinicians, the pattern was textbook, rare but not inexplicable. The family's social isolation, combined with economic stress and a father's deteriorating mental health, created a perfect echo chamber. Each member, instead of contradicting the delusion, reinforced it out of loyalty or fear. They fed each other's certainty, wrote Dr. Helen McCrae, the lead psychiatrist on the case. The family structure became a mirror of one mind, reflecting one fear. Media conditions in the late 1980s amplified that paranoia. America was closing the chapter on the Cold War. Nightly news carried stories of espionage, wiretaps, and political scandal. Television dramas thrived on conspiracy plots. For a man like Richard, educated enough to follow the news, isolated enough to lack context, it was fertile ground. The idea that someone was watching no longer seemed implausible. It was, in fact, what the whole country had been watching on their screens for years. One of the FBI analysts, reviewing the psychological report, put it succinctly. They didn't lose their minds at once. They lost them gradually together. The Duke report reconstructed the timeline leading up to the flight. In the final weeks before June 1989, Richard stopped sleeping more than 2 hours a night. He covered the windows in foil, claiming it blocked microwave listening devices. He made the family switch off the electricity for entire evenings. On June 9th, he withdrew $4,200 in cash from a local bank, every dollar the family had in savings. The next morning, he told them to pack. Diane asked where they were going. His reply was simple: away from here. When doctors interviewed the Harveys after their recovery, The same phrase surfaced again and again. We thought we were doing the right thing. None of them could pinpoint when fear had replaced reason. Diane described it as walking into a fog you don't notice until you're lost. Carla said the road trip felt like sleepwalking, half dream, half terror. Clinicians explained the phenomenon as shared psychosis, but within it lay deeper psychological mechanisms: dependence, obedience, and love. Families, they wrote, are built on trust, and when trust anchors itself in delusion, that delusion can feel like safety. Dr. McCrae summarized the condition in a single phrase that would later be cited in journals around the world. It was a perfect storm of isolation, exhaustion, and fear. A closed circle with no one left outside it to say, "This isn't real." By autumn, the Harveys' mental state had stabilized under treatment. Medication helped Richard sleep. Therapy reconnected him with the rational world he'd abandoned. Diane remained quiet, compliant, often apologetic. "I should have told someone," she said during her final session, "but I thought if we stayed together we'd be safe." For the FBI, the case ended not with an arrest, but a file marked closed psychological incident. Yet within the Bureau, it lingered as a cautionary study. Agents were trained afterward to recognize signs of group, delusional drift, families or small groups whose fears spiral into shared conviction. The official Duke paper, published in 1991, became a reference for psychiatrists worldwide. It noted that folie à famille required not just mental illness, but environment, an echo chamber where fear outweighs fact. And though the Harveys recovered, the study warned that such cases could reappear anywhere, in households, in communities, even in nations, whenever isolation and fear grow unchecked. In Pine Bluff, the townspeople never quite decided whether the Harveys had gone mad or seen something no one else could. Some kept the story alive in whispers, others tried to forget. But for the doctors who studied it, the lesson was clear. Madness, in the right conditions, doesn't need enemies. It only needs company. By the end of 1989, the FBI's final memo summed up the case in 8 simple words. No crime, no threat, just a family afraid. The file was boxed, sealed, and sent to Washington for archive. The porch light at the Harvey home, however, stayed on for years, a quiet memorial to a fear that once took shape, grew, and finally dissolved into the calm of understanding. By mid-July 1989, the Harvey family returned to Pine Bluff, North Carolina, under quiet supervision from Duke University's psychiatric unit. The drive home was escorted not by police cars or reporters this time, but by silence. 4 weeks earlier, they had been the subject of national headlines, their faces broadcast on Nightline and Good Morning America. Now they were simply 5 people riding back into a town that didn't know whether to welcome them or whisper. No charges were filed. There had been no crime, no victims, no conspiracy, only fear. Still, the FBI asked the family to remain under medical observation for 90 days. The diagnosis, shared delusional disorder, folie à famille, was not a label of guilt, but a prescription for healing. Richard was treated for acute psychosis with antipsychotic medication. Diane entered counseling for trauma and dependency. The 2 daughters began group therapy to learn how to separate their own thoughts from the echo of their parents. The Harveys' return made the evening news again, though in a different tone this time. The cameras that had once chased their disappearance now stood at a respectful distance. On a humid July afternoon, in front of the county courthouse, the family appeared briefly for a press conference organized by the sheriff's department. They looked thinner, quieter. Richard stood slightly apart from the others, his eyes downcast, hands clasped as if in prayer. Diane clutched her rosary. The children, grown but shaken, flanked them. Reporters asked the questions everyone already knew the answers to. "Mr. Harvey, what were you running from?" Richard paused, then spoke softly into the microphone. "At the time, we thought it was real. Every sound, every car outside. We believed someone wanted to hurt us." His voice faltered. "Now, I'm not sure what was real anymore." The next question came from a journalist with the Charlotte Observer. "Do you remember why you left your home?" This time it was James, the eldest son, who answered. His tone was even, practiced, but edged with fatigue. "They believed someone wanted to kill the family," he said. "Now they can't remember why." That sentence would become the headline the next morning, printed above a black and white photo of the family standing together but not touching. A family fled from nothing but fear itself. In Pine Bluff, reactions were mixed. Some neighbors brought casseroles, others avoided eye contact in the grocery store. A few still locked their doors in daylight. The Harveys' farm equipment business never reopened. Richard sold the earth-moving machinery within a month, saying quietly that he didn't trust the noise anymore. The town pastor organized a small service of Thanksgiving at the local church. Only a handful of people came. Those who attended said Richard sat in the back pew, head bowed, never speaking. After the service, he walked home alone. The family's old Ford F-150, the truck that had carried them through their 4-day odyssey, remained in the garage. No one drove it again. Layers of dust settled over the hood until it became a kind of monument, an artifact of panic. Photographers from Life magazine later visited Pine Bluff for a feature titled "When Fear Takes the Wheel." The most haunting image from that spread was simple. The blue pickup, still and silent, bathed in a shaft of sunlight filtering through the garage door. It became the enduring symbol of what psychologists later called the American Delusion Drive. Over the following months, the Harveys withdrew from public life. Carla found work in a nearby town. Lydia married a few years later and moved west. Diane remained in therapy, her days structured around small rituals, morning prayers, evening walks, and the slow return of sleep. Richard kept mostly to himself. He stopped watching television, stopped reading newspapers, and when asked by a neighbor if he believed they had been cured, he replied, "I just try not to listen anymore." For Pine Bluff, the case left an invisible scar. The town council passed a motion declaring June 10th, the day the Harveys left home, Lantern Night. Every summer since, residents lit their porch lights at dusk as a quiet reminder. Not every fear has a face, and not every disappearance needs a villain. By the next decade, the story of the vanishing Harveys faded from the headlines, but remained in classrooms. Psychology students at Duke and UNC studied it as a case of mass psychosis contained within a single family. Federal law enforcement included it in training materials on behavioral contagion. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit described it as a rare instance where fear was both the weapon and the wound. Interviews with the surviving children, conducted privately in the 1990s, revealed the long shadow left behind. Carla said she sometimes still woke at night, expecting her father to whisper, "They're listening." Lydia, in a 1999 radio interview, said she had learned to forgive him. "He wasn't trying to hurt us," she explained. "He thought he was saving us." Richard passed away quietly in 2004. The obituary was short, no mention of the road trip, only that he was a devoted husband and father. Diane outlived him by 6 years, spending her final years in a nursing home near Boone, where she often watched the sunset through a small window facing west, the same direction the family had driven all those years ago. Today, the Harvey house still stands at the edge of town. The paint has peeled, the windows clouded with dust. But on summer evenings, one light continues to burn above the front porch. a ritual now tended by James, who never left Pine Bluff. When asked why he keeps it on, he answers simply, "We turned it on when they were gone. We leave it on now because they came back." For the people of Pine Bluff, that small light means many things: a warning, a memory, perhaps even forgiveness. It glows faintly through the North Carolina night, steady and unblinking, a reminder that sometimes the mind's darkness can be deeper than any forest, and that coming home is not about distance, but about learning to believe in safety again. In the end, there were no heroes and no villains, only 5 lives caught inside a storm of their own making. The world moved on, the files were archived, and the Harveys' story slipped quietly into legend. But for those who lived through that summer, one truth remains clear. Fear, once it takes shape, can drive even the sanest among us farther than we ever meant to go. And sometimes, if we're lucky, just far enough to find our way back. In the months that followed the Harveys' return, the question that echoed through North Carolina's legal circles was as simple as it was confounding. If no law was broken, who pays for what was lost? The rescue operation that had unfolded across 3 states in June 1989 had cost nearly $280,000, a figure that covered helicopters, fuel, overnight manpower, and the coordination of dozens of agencies. For weeks, local taxpayers grumbled that a family's delusion had become the public's expense. Yet when state attorneys reviewed the case, they found no grounds for prosecution. The Harveys had committed no fraud, no obstruction, no willful deception. They had simply run. Still, the legal vacuum left discomfort. And so, for the first time in state history, the Attorney General's Office and the Department of Health and Human Services proposed a joint hearing, not a criminal trial, but a public inquiry into what they called collective psychological disturbance and its civic consequences. It would be held in Raleigh under the IFI jurisdiction of the North Carolina Superior Court, with a single goal: to decide how a society should respond when fear, rather than intent, triggers chaos. The hearing opened on March 6, 1990. The courtroom was neither tense nor hostile, but curious. Rows of local residents, reporters, and mental health advocates filled the benches. At the front, under the seal of the state, sat Judge Walter Ingram, a dignified man in his 60s whose voice carried the quiet authority of long service. "This is not a criminal trial," he reminded the audience in his opening statement. "No one is here to be punished. We are here to understand." Representatives from the FBI Behavioral Unit, the State Bureau of Investigation, and Duke University's Psychiatry Department presented evidence. They described, in clinical language, the rare case of folie à famille, how isolation, exhaustion, and stress had turned an ordinary household into a closed loop of paranoia. They projected diagrams of the Harveys' home, maps of their journey, and handwritten notes retrieved from the family's kitchen drawer. The most haunting of these was a line scrawled on a yellow notepad in Richard Harvey's handwriting: "If you tell them, they'll make it true." For some, that note summarized the entire case. A man so consumed by imagined threats that silence became his only defense. When the hearing turned to community impact, the tone grew sharper. A representative from the state auditor's office outlined the rescue costs, emphasizing the burden placed on emergency services. "When the public perceives danger," she said, "we respond. But when fear itself becomes the danger, who bears responsibility?" Several citizens took the stand. A farmer from Pine Bluff argued that the Harveys should repay the cost. "If a man sets fire to his own barn because he thinks it's haunted, he still pays the fire crew," he said plainly. "This should be no different." His statement drew nods from some, murmurs from others, but mental health advocates pushed back. Dr. Helen McCrae, the Duke psychiatrist who had led the clinical assessment, countered firmly. To punish the Harveys would be to punish the symptom, not the cause. What we saw here was not malice. It was untreated illness, intensified by isolation. If we want to prevent another case, we must invest in care, not retribution. Her testimony shifted the mood of the room. Even those who had arrived skeptical now listened with quieter faces. Reporters from the Charlotte Observer and the Raleigh Times scribbled down her phrase, "This was not crime, it was crisis." By the second day, the hearing had moved beyond the Harveys themselves to a broader reckoning with what their story revealed about life in rural America at the close of the 1980s. Experts testified that more than 40% of counties in North Carolina lacked access to any form of licensed mental health service. For isolated communities, fear had become an unspoken epidemic, manifesting in rumors, superstitions, or, in rare cases, the kind of shared delusion that had consumed the Harvey family. Public opinion split cleanly in two. Editorial pages mirrored the divide. "Accountability is part of healing," wrote the Winston-Salem Journal, arguing that the state should recoup costs from the family's property insurance. "Fear is not a felony," countered the Charlotte Observer, urging compassion and calling the Harveys' ordeal a mirror held up to our neglect of rural mental health. The debate spilled into living rooms, radio talk shows, and Sunday sermons. Was collective delusion a matter for doctors or for law? Could a family's terror justify the mobilization of hundreds of first responders? And if not, how could it be prevented without punishing those too fragile to understand their own illness? It was against that backdrop that the North Carolina General Assembly, moved by the public inquiry, introduced and passed the Rural Mental Awareness Act of 1990. The legislation allocated state funds for traveling counselors and crisis hotlines in underserved counties, an unglamorous but vital acknowledgement that mental health was as much a civic responsibility as public safety. On the final day of the hearing, Judge Ingram read a brief closing statement that would later be quoted across the nation. His words were simple, deliberate, and without sentiment. "This court finds no basis for criminal liability. The Harveys acted under genuine terror, not deceit. Yet their fear, unchecked, endangered others. Let this record stand not as indictment, but as instruction. Fear, when shared and believed, can become more powerful than any real enemy. And if we wish to guard against it, we must learn to listen before it takes hold." The gallery stood in silence. There was no applause, only a collective exhale. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around James Harvey, the eldest son. He was calm, composed, wearing the same gray suit he had worn at every proceeding. When asked what justice meant to him now, he said quietly, "It means no one else has to go through this alone." The next morning, the Charlotte Observer ran its final story on the case under the headline, "A Family's Fear Rewrites the Law." Within weeks, the television crews packed up, the discussions faded, and Pine Bluff sank back into the anonymity of small-town life. But within hospitals and courtrooms, the Harvey case became a reference point, a lesson in how systems built to handle crimes must sometimes adapt to handle confusion, compassion, and human fragility. Years later, Judge Ingram's words would be quoted again at a law symposium in Raleigh. This was the court without a crime, but not without consequence. And in that single phrase, the story of the Harveys found its quiet legacy, not as a tale of madness, but as proof that even the most irrational fear can leave behind something rational: change. After 1990, the Harvey case became a teaching reference at the FBI Academy and several medical schools across the U.S., cited as a classic example of shared psychosis, a delusion spreading within a family. Students studying behavioral science were asked the same question: when does protection turn into paranoia? the Harveys withdrew completely from public life, moving to Boone, North Carolina, where they lived quietly in the mountains. Neighbors remembered them simply as the couple who grew tomatoes and never missed church on Sunday. They never gave interviews, and their names gradually faded from public conversation. In 1992, independent filmmaker Thomas Ellery released a PBS documentary titled The Family That Ran. There was no music, no dramatization, only images of empty highways and an abandoned farmhouse. Critics praised its restraint, calling it a quiet portrait of modern fear. Over time, the case came to symbolize what scholars called the decade of invisible fear, an America standing at the threshold of technology, Cold War paranoia, and growing mistrust of unseen powers. The Harveys' flight became a metaphor for the anxiety of a society that had lost its sense of control. Each year, on June 10th, the town of Pine Bluff still holds a silent vigil. Porch lights glow through the night, not to guide anyone home, but as a gentle reminder of what the case taught them long ago, that not every threat comes from outside, and sometimes the darkest places to get lost are the ones inside our own minds. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who believes every mystery deserves the truth. Your views help keep forgotten cases alive and the lights of hope burning. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because somewhere out there, another story is still waiting to be found.